Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you to our training session here involving our street design manual that has been, I guess, in process and worked on for about the last year or maybe 9 or 10 months. It's been a long time coming, and we're really excited to kind of finish this, put it together, and actually begin putting it into use as you'll see today. And that's really kind of the point of today's exercise and training, is to kind of not only show the features and benefits of the manual abstractly, but also put it to work as well, and work through a real example of how we intend this design manual to be applicable to our streets here in Kalamazoo. And like I said, it's been great to finally wrap this up and do some really good work here with Smith Group. So we have kind of a layout of what these next couple hours are going to entail. Obviously, beginning with an introduction, it's a good place to start. Go through an overview of the manual in general. It's very thorough. There are a lot of chapters and sections to it. So I think that's helpful to kind of show where everything is and what all is actually included in the manual. And then from there, go into the street typologies and that decision-making process of how a street falls or where it falls in that typology in reference to the manual. Our modal hierarchy, how do we prioritize what street elements are going to be involved or considered in a project, and where those kind of, I guess, rank more or less as we consider all of the elements in the right-of-way space, and as well as provide a checklist for our design projects to make sure that we're hitting every single topic, or at least considering or thinking about every element when these projects are getting put together. And then from there, talk about key design elements to consider, or I guess how we kind of visualize each element to be designed based on the street typology. And then we're going to work through an actual exercise in the small group breakout rooms. Will be our final exercise for the day. And we will begin with introductions. I guess first up, reading from the top, would be Christina Anderson.
Hi, I think everybody knows who I am. Christina Anderson, City Planner for Kalamazoo.
And I'm Anthony Ladd in the Public Services Department.
I'm Dennis Randolph, and I am the traffic engineer for the city.
Hello, everyone. My name is Janet Atarian, and I'm a principal at Smith Group, and delighted to be here with you today.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm Oliver Kiley, landscape architect and principal at Smith Group. So Janet and I both worked with the city on putting together the design manual. Just since we have a pretty big group today, we're going to hold off on having people introduce themselves until we switch into the small group activities, and we can kind of kick those off and people can introduce themselves to their group mates when we get down to that section. Just a note too, we have a few places in the presentation where we'll pause and kind of ask questions, but if people have questions as we go throughout this, feel free to kind of raise your hand in Zoom, and we can take a pause and help answer clarifying questions as we go. This is meant to be conversational and informative, and we don't want people feeling like they're confused or not able to answer a question. So please feel free to raise your hand during that time. Okay.
I think this is where I start off, Oliver, and
Yep.
Hello, everybody. I didn't say hello before, but I wanted to just give a short lead in to what we're going to be doing today and what this manual means. And the day before yesterday, I got an email that the Secretary of Transportation, Department of Transportation, had put out a new program. It's a safety program. It's the next step, the zero fatal program that's been around a few years has kind of had mixed success. And as a traffic person, a long-time traffic person, I never really bought into what they were doing with that program because it didn't change the things I thought were important to make streets safe and livable. And that's the words we're running with nowadays: livability, sustainability, safety. Anyway, Secretary Buttigieg, I hope I got there, I messed it up, but the secretary put out a new program, and it's a fundamental change in how we're going to be looking at safety from now on in an attempt to get to the point where we can have zero fatalities on our roads. I think that's important because you've all heard about all the money that's come out with the new bills that Congress has passed, and I assume there'll be some more money too over the next couple of years as Congress works things out among themselves. But those programs are going to be tied to the secretary's direction regarding safety. And the interesting point, and I think what applies here and what I wanted to tell you about, was that it's more than just the physical things that we've done in the past, how wide a road is, that's, and capacity and speed. There's going to be more of an emphasis on people and how people interrelate with streets and how the community relates to the transportation system. And that's what this design manual really helps us to do. It helps to look past the old Ashto Green book. And I love the Ashto Green book, and before it, the purple book and the blue book, every color in the rainbow. But making streets safe and making them livable for tomorrow is a lot different than taking a table from the Ashto book and applying it to a particular situation. And what the design manual is going to do, it's going to help guide us along a path as we start into our design for streets in the city. And I guess tune us up, make us understand first the people part of what's going on. And that's why you're hearing terms like typology and something like that. What is that? But the intent is to really focus on how we are going to look differently when we're designing. I'm really happy about that. I've been designing roads a long time, and this is a change. And what the secretary said the other day is a big change. It's a change I've been waiting for years. And we've got a chance here in the city to be real leaders in this change, especially with the big projects that Anthony's guiding along for us. The two-waying project, if nothing else, is a big deal. And it'll be a project where we can apply the design manual and have something better and different in the end. And hopefully it'll also work real well for carrying traffic. I don't forget about that. I'm a traffic engineer, but it'll help us to make and right size our streets, which is really important. And what we all have to remember is it does change some of those things we've talked about in the past. Level of service, design speeds, that was always the holy grail of traffic engineering and highway engineering, level of service. Yeah, level of service is there, but we don't necessarily strive for an A or B or even a C anymore, because those levels of service don't necessarily serve the community and don't necessarily make safe streets. You know, we killed 38,000 people on our nation's highways last year. That's a lot of folks to die and to lose. And the vast majority of those people die in crashes that are speed related. Okay, so emphasizing speed and design, in other words, to make the speed the highest as possible, is not a way to make streets as safe as possible. So the manual is going to help us do that. And it's different. And I think that's the biggest thing to overcome, that is different. Can I change slides, or can you do that, Oliver?
I got it.
Okay.
I think it's jumping over to Christina for a moment.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dennis.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everybody. This is Christina again. I just want to kind of ground our work very quickly, right? Everything that we do at the city is in alignment with our strategic vision and our 2025 master plan, and this work is no different. If you've had a chance to flip through the document, you've seen kind of that grounding at the beginning, talking about being rooted in our connected city and complete neighborhoods goal. This document really took what we started in the master plan, which was loosely aligning street types very generally and at a high level, and really refined that to think a little more thoughtfully or carefully about that marriage between streets and land use. And so that's been refined, and we have a new set of street types and typologies in the city that took the work from the master plan and did it better, made it more detailed. This work also is in alignment with our complete streets policy, which we approved about 2 years ago, and have frankly been struggling on how to implement, right? I mean, Dennis, Anthony, George, Tom, everyone who works on traffic, Jesse, you know, on individual projects, we always keep complete streets and the goals in mind, but we haven't until this point figured out how we make it something that is automatic every day, every project. And we're really thinking about all of our streets in this way. And so between this document, our complete streets advisory committee, which is made up of citizens, and kind of an internal committee that we're going to restart, you know, these things are going to be thought about in a timely manner, right? So this document, also, if you've had a chance to look at it, talks about process, right? When do we think about these things? And, you know, lately it's been, oh crap, this is coming up next year. Oh, this neighborhood plan said this, but it was way too late to include anything, right? Because budgets were done, designs were done. And so this is meant to be helping us set ourselves up for success and very thoughtful planning. So our 5-year capital improvements plan and what happens in the years before the capital improvements plan, as we're thinking about what goes in and what needs to be included. So this is all in alignment with everything else that we've done. And again, just one more implementation activity from our 2025 master plan that was done with both public services and planning kind of moving together to complete this step. Thanks, Oliver. Next slide.
I wanted to emphasize, and again, that we're going to be looking at our designs differently, but that doesn't mean that there's no support for what we're doing. And especially with the secretary's new announcement and his programs, his emphasis on looking at things differently, we've got the support. So, you know, often we worry, you know, we're going to try something different, we're going to get sued, we're going to end up in court. Well, we aren't doing things that are contrary to good engineering practice, you know, and we're going to be using guidance from the Federal Highway Administration and MDOT. All the dots are having to buy into this, and whether they like it or not, I guess I'll add that, because the new money that's coming is going to require that they buy into this. And so again, a lot of people have to look at things differently, but there's good support. AASHTO, the organization that helps guide a lot of designs in the country, has many committees set up, and I sit on a couple of those committees that are making the changes necessary to follow the processes and the thoughts that are in our design manual. NACTO, which is the organization that cities in particular use to guide their designs, has been pushing these ideas, frankly, for a number of years, and they finally have the legislative power and authority behind them, their ideas, which is really great because cities are an important part of how things get designed, and they're going to be playing even more and more important part in the future. So you're going to see adjustments in the guidance we receive. And one of the things I wanted to mention, I don't know if Oliver had mentioned it, but we're recording the session, but we're going to be showing the session as consultants come online to do designs for us. They're going to be seeing the same information because we want them to know what our direction is. And as city folks, right, we have to make sure that they also buy into this program. Again, it is different, and I know how hard it is to do different things in engineering, but it really is a positive step, and it certainly is going to help us as a community. So I have to see who's next here, Oliver.
Oh, you have one more, Dennis.
Yeah,
You're up.
I'm clicking. I got 3 screens going here, and it's an overload
Yep.
for an old guy. But
You're doing great.
I just wanted to mention as an instructor, and if you don't know, I spend a lot of time in instructing in engineering field, that manuals like this are really nice, and change like this is great. The tough part is making everybody comfortable. So what we're working on, I know Anthony and George and Tom in particular, just working on a lot of processes for our designs that help so we don't forget things, so that we're covered, so that we're documented, because we want to document what we're doing, not in a negative sense, but I mentioned the other day, what we're embarking on here in Kalamazoo, especially with getting the two-way project going, but also all the other jobs, is we're making a difference, and we can show other communities how to do this, which I think is a really great thing to do. So I'm looking forward to it. Again, we're aligning streets and transportation to the community, and that hasn't always been done. I'll testify. I've worked for 4 cities and 3 counties, and we didn't always line things up with what the community wanted when we were building roads. And that is a change that's long overdue, and that's what we're going to be doing here. So hopefully you'll enjoy this, because I look at it as it's a challenge, but also it's something different. It's something to look forward to. So next slide.
Yeah, and just to build on what Dennis is saying, and Christina as well, I mean, this manual is really, meant to tie our city values, what we value as a city, what our goals are collectively, tie that in with a design manual, which is really cool, and I think that's what makes it unique and specific to Kalamazoo, different than some of those other national guides. One, it's tailored to what we want to see in the city, but I guess kind of the guiding process in that is built on these values and goals that were also, I mean, they're espoused in many places throughout the city and by elected officials and city staff and public, but also laid out specifically in the Imagine Kalamazoo 2025 master plan. So that's kind of, I mean, we keep harping on that, but that's really you will see that throughout this manual, that reflection of these goals and values. And I guess just to kind of briefly speak on each of them again, we have connected city, connecting neighborhoods, using the streets to connect people, to get them from one place to the other and not to separate people and create barriers. Environmentally and responsible and sustainable practices. You will see that a lot in our green infrastructure and some of the decisions that we're using to drive our street projects, as far as stormwater, our tree plantings, our tree features that help the trees to thrive, and overall move towards a more sustainable future. Equity and opportunity for all. I guess this kind of ties in, well, they all tie together, but also creating emphasis on multimodal use, creating equity for all users, and not necessarily prioritizing vehicular traffic when it makes sense. Safe community also. Obviously, by building these streets in a way that's more equitable for all users, at the same time, it creates a safer, more inviting street for everyone to use. Complete neighborhoods. I think that does tie back to the connectivity and safety element. One thing that I think this guide reflects too is, and as a city, it is not only what's being done in our right of way, but also realizing that land use is a big part of this, and that those two elements, the street and the land use around it, can't be separated, and we want those to work together. Our goals and values do not stop when we leave the right of way. So trying to use our streets to tie into that land use, to make complete neighborhoods, to create these vibrant places, off of the right of way, but also within the bounds of our streets, to where we can create that community, create a sense of well-being for all residents and businesses that are here in the city. And then I guess finally, resilient infrastructure and good governance. This is really at the core of everything that we do. I think that by believing in and investing in these values is good governance, but also for the assets themselves. We're really committed these last couple of years. I think we've placed a huge emphasis on our asset management capabilities and long-term planning to create something that's sustainable from a budget sense, but also sustainable for these asset conditions, to where we have something that will last for generations to come, and something that we can build on for everyone here in the city.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. Before we switch to the next section and jump into process, just wanted to pause here, see if there were any overall questions that people had. I saw a hand or two go up and come down. Maybe we got your question covered, but wanted to open that up if anybody had something that they wanted to add, or a question on the upfront piece here. Seeing none, I'm going to move on. So I think, Janet, you're going to jump in and kick this section off.
Yes, hello everyone. So that was a great introduction, and I think it really gives you a good feel for where this is coming from, how important it is. So let's dive into what is it and how is it going to help all of you do what you do, and make your jobs hopefully easier. So the manual sort of gets broken down into sort of two big sections, if you will, and one is about process. So a little bit about the how, and the other one is a little bit about the specific design guidance. So a little bit about the sort of what, if you will. And we want to start talking about the process a little bit with all of you, and really walking through how this is going to work, because really what the process we hope we've done a good job of sort of laying it out in a way that it's really user friendly. That is the point, is to make it so that it's as easy as possible to use, and really helps you get to the kinds of solutions that achieve some of those goals that you just heard Christina and Anthony and Dennis talk about. So starting off, what is this manual for? What is it supposed to cover? It's really meant to cover, all the types of efforts that happen in the public right of way. Complete streets happen when everybody, from doing a signal project to a resurfacing to a streetscape to a reconstruction, is looking at their projects through the lens of complete streets. And they're understanding how their piece of the pie, whatever they're doing, adds up to create that more livable, multimodal, safe environment for as many users as we possibly can achieve, and certainly our most vulnerable users. Next slide. So this sort of outlines the general process. What is the most important takeaway from this is you start early and it goes all the way through operations, right? Complete Streets is not a thing that you do at a certain point and you sort of just say, check, done, I've got it. The point is, like any good guiding principle, right? It should be informing the projects that you're selecting and how you're prioritizing what goes into the CIP. It should be informing then how you develop the scope of work for that project, how you decide how much funding should go into that project. Obviously, it should then be informing the design and how you actually design it and the components and how that goes together and the street cross section and all that kind of stuff. Then it needs to obviously get built right? Is it following the design intent? Is that green infrastructure really going to function? Is the ADA goals really achieved? Whatever it might be. And then of course that follows even into operations and how is it being maintained? Are you able to plow the bike lanes? Are you able to keep the trees alive and thriving? The list sort of goes on, right? So, and of course, it's not just about projects that the public sector does. It is also very much for the private sector. So when you're working with developers or a developer comes in and they're going to be doing work in the public way, we want them to be looking through the eyes of this project process just as much and following this. And as Dennis mentioned, it's who's the audience? It's consultants, it's the public, it's folks who work for the city, it's developers, it's a range of folks. Next. So what are the sort of key steps in this process? We are going to spend really the rest of this presentation sort of walking you through this. And as we've mentioned, we're going to have a detailed exercise at the end where you're actually going to get to walk yourself through this and hopefully really get familiarity with how it works. You've heard us talk about the typologies. We're gonna explain that in a lot more detail. But essentially, we've taken the streets of Kalamazoo and we've mapped them and we've assigned them typologies. So you don't have to figure out that typology. You just have to be able to figure out how to sort of read the map and figure that out. There's some specialty aspects to that we'll go into. The other thing which you've sort of heard us talk about is the modal hierarchy. What modal hierarchy essentially is, if you're not familiar with it, is as you go through the decision-making process, right? And there's always trade-offs. There's never enough public right-of-way to do everything we want. And quite frankly, we don't really necessarily just want to build wider and wider streets so we can fit, everything in maybe in the ideal level of service quality, right? And so there are trade-offs. There are different types of streets, right? There are different types of land uses. So how do you determine which modes you're going to prioritize? And once you have that, that's going to help you make decisions later on about cross sections, about design elements, and about all of those types of things. Then there's the value-based checklist. Now, the value-based checklist is important for a number of reasons. we did not decide in this to dictate a modal hierarchy. Sometimes that's done, right? It's just like, you know, it's going to be pedestrians first, it's going to be cyclists, it's going to be transit, whatever it might be. We wanted to give the flexibility of people looking at the existing conditions, the planned conditions, the specific wants and needs of the community, and determining that modal hierarchy. But how do you do that? Well, the value-based checklist is aligned to those values that go back to the Imagine Kalamazoo and those goals that Anthony just went over that you saw. And underneath all of those, there are a set of questions for each phase in the process. And those questions help you get at the modal hierarchy, and we'll be showing you that in a little bit. But they also just help you gather the data and think through the things that you want to think through that help you figure out how to design it, what are going to be your priorities, what are the different facts or existing plans that should be influencing how the road gets designed. All that kind of good stuff is contained in that value-based checklist. It's, I think, very nicely organized, and the questions are there for your use. And not every question is going to be appropriate for every project, but hopefully if you go through that, it's going to make sure you don't forget to think about something, or, you know, bring in a piece of information that's going to really help drive the right solutions forward as you move through it. Then there's the design element checklist. That's going to help you figure out, you know, specifically with you've got this typology and you've got this mode hierarchy, you know, what pieces should be going into the project. And then of course the detailed design element guide, which is then going to give you the technical information you need to say, great, I've decided I need a protected bike lane. How do I design that protected bike lane, right? What are the standards? What's the best practice? Where can I find more information? That's going to all be in the detailed design guidelines. So that's really the key steps in the process, and they're all contained in this manual, and hopefully they will be pretty self-evident once you kind of get a basic understanding for it, and you can walk yourself through on all sorts of different types of projects.
Great. Thanks, Janet. So I'm just going to talk through the typology piece at a high level. So, you know, for those who have been in the transportation planning and traffic engineering world for a long time, there's the whole kind of functional classification of roads that has been used for a long, long time as a basis for design and planning. You know, collectors, arterials, major arterials, minor collectors, all of those things. Sometimes those get simplified down to, you know, primary streets versus more local streets. And that's always been a very sort of auto-centric, vehicle-centric way of looking at road classification. And the idea of street typologies is that they take, you know, what are the functional needs of the roads? And that's not just vehicles, but it's really all users of the street corridor, whether they're walking, whether they're on transit, whether they're riding a bike or driving a vehicle, those functional needs of the road, and then also looking at the adjacent land use context that's along the roadway corridor. Is it going through a residential area? Is it going through a heavy shopping area? Is it more suburban or more urban in nature? And so the typologies exist at the intersection between those two, between the functional needs of the road and that land use context. And the recommendations and the strategies and the intent of that typology is to respond to both of those two conditions, to be sensitive to that land use. You probably heard the term for, you know, context sensitive design, being sensitive to that land use, making sure that the adjacent landowners are treated as a user of the roadway too, and that their experience and their environment is a critical part of how the roadway really serves the community in addition to those transportation functions. And as Christina had mentioned earlier, the 2025 master plan had laid out an initial set of street typologies to be considered. We took those as a group and kind of pushed and pulled on them, added a couple here and there, and did a very exhaustive dive through the whole city to assign those street typologies out. So you can see those 9 different typologies here. So urban center streets are really your major kind of downtown streets, like Michigan Ave. Other downtown streets, event and festival streets, so like Kalamazoo Mall, where you might have more of a curbless design or something that's designed more to be used as an event space at times. And these two, the mixed neighborhood mixed use and commercial mixed use, those really align with areas in the master plan that were called out for some of the neighborhood or commercial nodes for potential development and additional activity. So a street that complements that in more of a traditional neighborhood context versus more of a suburban context. There's also, of course, roads that are going through a more suburban orient environment themselves. So that's the city connector streets. And then really looking at acknowledging that there's many different levels of neighborhood level local streets that exist in the city. And some of those may be the smallest, most local roads, but others are ones where, they're just a little bit bigger and, maybe they don't have traffic signals at every stop, but there's a lot of cut through traffic happening on those streets and in those neighborhoods just because of the way they're oriented in the grid and the connections that they make. And so are there things we can be thinking about to design those streets differently so that even if they are picking up some of that, through traffic, that they're again sensitive to the residential context and the neighborhood context that they're going through. So that's kind of how the street typologies are organized. And then you'll see in the exercise themselves, I'll when we get to that section later on, I'll point out where you can see the full descriptions for all of the typologies. But this is just a snippet out of the plan for the Main Street one. And you can see that the typologies provide, a generic cross section looking at typically what, the right-of-way widths for that type of roadway corridor is often. It provides a list of some of the typical features that are usually found in that typology. And I should mention that while the typologies are often looking kind of backwards, if you will, towards traffic volumes and the kind of functional role that the road has played, they're future looking and kind of prescriptive in terms of what they aspire to be. So I think that's an important definition. These typical features aren't about mapping what is, it's about mapping what it could be moving towards in the future. So as I mentioned, they relate to the network function of the road, the land use context. They do provide a set of kind of starting point priorities for different types of users that people can use as a starting point to have that modal hierarchy discussion, and then the typical kinds of features and design considerations for different users is incorporated within those typology descriptions. Okay. Janet, I think back to you for a moment.
Yes, get my mic off. So as we talked about sort of this issue of the modal hierarchy, right? And how do we really go about establishing it? It is really important, as I said before, in terms of navigating those trade-off decisions, right? So if you've got so much right of way and you have to figure out, is it really important for us to get a bike lane out on this street or not? Or should we maybe be widening the sidewalks? Or is it important that we really accommodate trucks on the street or transit, right? And make sure that's really got a high level of accommodation, right? There's always these series of trade-offs, right? One thing though that you really want to always keep in mind with your modal hierarchy is it's not just about who's using the road, it is also about your most vulnerable users. And so you tend to often on your modal hierarchy have either pedestrians or bicyclists up near the top because they are always your most vulnerable users. Even if you know it's going to be a road that's going to have a lot of vehicle and truck users, unless it's pretty exclusive, you also really want to keep in mind vulnerability. Again, that doesn't mean that you're not making a lot of decisions to accommodate those other users and make sure that they can can move freely through the corridor. But it does mean that you're also really going to make sure that your most vulnerable users can be safe and can be accommodated, and that never has to be forgotten. And so again, we created the flexibility. We're not dictating which and where, and it gives you the flexibility to look at those different unique conditions and decide. But often you're going to have pedestrians up right at the top of that. And you can see kind of here, this is that example that Oliver was mentioning that comes out of a typology, right? So, and it's sort of saying, hey, this is maybe the default for this type of typology. You can see pedestrians are there at the top. You've got, in this case, it's bicyclist, transit, you know, but again, that's going to be very dependent. Do you have transit? Is it part of the bicycle plan? And those are going to be those questions that you're going to find in the value-based questions. It's going to ask you to look for those types of things, right? And that's going to help you say, okay, this is maybe the default where I start, but yeah, this street is on the bicycle plan. The intention is to make this one of our bicycle routes. Definitely want to put bicycle out there. If that's not really the intention, but it's a major transit route, maybe bicyclists come, you know, drop down to, you know, transit goes up, right? So these are the different kinds of trade-offs that you want to look at, and you can see some of the categories there that we're looking at. And you know, this is also a real opportunity when you're doing the typologies to bring in those other planning efforts, which quite frankly will probably be updated and change over time, you know, so you know, looking at the latest, but you know, if there's a pedestrian plan, if there's stuff going on around placemaking and activation work, is there the bicycle plan? What does the transit agency have in mind? What are their most important routes? What are they trying to improve? Where do they have routes that you know, speed matters and their buses are getting caught up? You know, where do you see obviously traffic constraints and issues? So all of those other things are coming in. And you're getting a chance to bring those to the table and help them understand your modal hierarchy, keeping in mind, though, that you've got that typology, and that typology is tied to your context and your land use, right? And so you want to bring those things together when you're establishing your modal hierarchy. And then when you've got that, once you've got that typology and you've got that modal hierarchy, that's going to allow you to make a whole series of other decisions that are more design-based and specific around that cross-section and around those specific components. So what you see here is a little bit about that value-based checklist that I've been talking about. And basically this chart just lets you know, hey, the value-based checklist is there and your friend in every phase of the process. And there are questions in those checklists against all of those major goals that we outlined, right? And so this is really, the value-based checklist is your friend. It's that list you want to keep going back to every step of the way and say, hey, did I think of this? So this is just an example, and you'll see a lot more of this when we jump in and do our exercises. But right, so goal, connected city, 3 driving points right there, strong connections between a diverse range of people and places, and so on. And then what you're seeing here is just what we call the first phase questions. So because the first phase is when you want to just determine that modal hierarchy. And you can also tell the modal hierarchy specific questions because they will be called out with that little orange diamond, and they do appear underneath the different values. But you can see right here, there's those questions. Read those, ask and take a look. How do they apply to your project? What are the answers specific to the project that you're working on? And use these to help you figure out what your modal hierarchy is. And quite frankly, this is going to ensure that the street design isn't siloed, right? that you're actually thinking about what are some of the larger and other efforts that are going on at the city scale, at the regional scale, those different plans that are out there, and that the street design is being tied to that more holistic set of influences that are out there. So that is how this all sort of comes together to help you get that modal hierarchy and learn more about the project.
And kind of as a bridge between these two, and you'll see during the exercises Janet mentioned, we have the full sort of checklist for all the different phases of work called out. And a lot of those questions in the checklist will point towards specific design elements that might need to be considered or incorporated into the design. And that's really where this design element checklist piece comes in. The chapter 4 of the report or of the design manual includes 6 different sections that really break down the street right away into different kind of use categories and talks about all of the detailed guidance for there. But there's a lot in that section. And so as a way of trying to get down a little bit closer to what it is that a particular street type needs to look at, the manual includes what we're calling this design element checklist. And this is just the pedestrian box. And so there's a box for each of those different use categories: transit, vehicle and roadway, bicycle facilities, and so on. And so what this checklist does is it lists all the different elements that are in the design manual where there is detailed design guidance. It lists all of the 9 different typologies for streets. And then the cells in the checklist are color coded based on really, is that an element that is absolutely required and you need to look at how it needs to be incorporated into that street design. So that's the kind of spruce green boxes. The more yellow-green boxes are things that are recommended. So this is something that, this element you should consider if there's an opportunity to work that in. It's recommended that it be installed. You should have a pretty good reason for why you're not considering installing or incorporating that design element in, if it's something that's recommended and there's an opportunity for it. The lighter blue boxes are more optional or situational. Those could be things that are really nice to have for that particular street corridor, could work really well, but there may be conditions or stipulations on when it applies in that particular area, or it may not deliver a lot of impact or benefit in one situation as compared to a different situation. So for example, just to pick one out, public seating in the downtown environment, on your major streets, on the urban center streets and the event festival streets, where you have a lot of people collecting and congregating and activities and events happening, seating is pretty important to think about in that urban design. As you get into more of the other downtown streets or other commercial corridors, seating is a good thing to have. Is it required? Maybe not, but you should really think hard about where there may be an opportunity to work it in, versus when you start to get into more of the suburban land use areas or into more of the residential streets, seating's probably not as critical. Of course, there's always the option to be able to incorporate it or to weave it in somewhere, but it's not a driving need. And then the orange boxes are things that are limited or restricted. So this is something that is usually either not allowed or it's allowed only under certain situations or certain conditions. And if that element wants to be incorporated in on that particular street, it may require some additional discussion with the design team to make sure there's a strong justification and case for that design element. And then the last section of the report, chapter 4, as I mentioned, this is really where each of those designed elements gets anywhere from a page or 2 to 3 or 4 pages worth of kind of detailed guidance. So this was just looking at pedestrian refuge islands that are often incorporated as part of, or that are incorporated as part of crosswalks. Just pulled this one out as an example. And so what the guidance will provide, the guidance for each element is broken into 4 sections. There's a section at the top that just talks about, what's the intent of this design element, a basic description of it in just written form. a section that talks about the use and application. So what are the relevant locations? Are there specific notes related back to the street typology that need to be emphasized about where that design element makes sense to be used or not? This section also will frequently talk about related design elements. So are there other design elements in the manual that you should really be cross-referencing and looking at to make sure that they're aligned and that you're not creating an incompatibility or a conflict? Or conversely, maybe there's a great opportunity to bring two different things together. So that related design element section covers that. And then it gets into the actual design and operations side of it. And so this is where any of the detailed design guidance comes through, looking at widths, dimensions, layout, materials. There's sections for related to sustainability or utility considerations. There'll be references to other established guidance. So as Dennis had mentioned earlier, we're drawing on a lot of the established national guidance to feed into this. So those design references will be listed out. And then the final piece that's actually not showing up on the image here is also related to operations and maintenance. So what are those long-term maintenance considerations? As you're thinking through the design of an element, it's important to be thinking about how it's going to be maintained. Are there things that should influence the design based on the maintenance needs or maintenance resources related to that particular design element? So that's kind of how chapter 4 is generally laid out. Before we switch on to the next, I'll just pause there. So that was kind of a fairly detailed overview of the whole process. And just to reiterate a couple key points, it's really can start all the way back, at the planning phase of identifying projects that might go into the CIP plan, and the checklist questions that relate to that phase 1 planning stage in the process can really be used at the onset to help scope and identify, what is this project? What could it potentially be? It can then move into that phase 2 set of questions where you really develop more detailed scope and budgets and fee for the project, and then on into the design and engineering. So just wanted to reiterate that process once more. Pause, any quick questions? This is our last chunk of the formal presentation. So
you can always, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Janet.
I was just gonna say, please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat too as we go, if you're thinking about them, and we will definitely look at those and make sure we get those answered too, and or raise your hand or jump in with some questions.
Yeah. So the manual itself includes, I don't remember the exact number, it's over 50 or over 60 different design elements that are broken out and discussed here. And so what we wanted to do in this next section is pull out really just a handful of those that have we think some of the more of an outsized impact on shaping how the overall street corridor comes together, how the right-of-way is designed, how that range of different users gets accommodated. There's some critical ones that relate to, putting together, sometimes people will use the word corridor assembly. So how are you stitching together that cross section of the road? What are those major pieces that are going to be taking up right-of-way space that we want to talk through? So we're going to walk through that right now. And again, if we have questions as we're going through this, please drop them in chat or raise your hand. Happy to spend time talking through this. So one of the first ones relates back to pedestrian areas and sidewalks. So the design element identifies, the sidewalk as really that clear walking path that you have between, as where your sidewalk typically is. That's often set, right at the edge of the right-of-way line. And then what we refer to as the pedestrian area includes the sidewalk, but it's everything else from that right-of-way line over to the curb line, the edge of the roadway itself. So that includes the sidewalk. That also includes the amenity zone. Sometimes that can be called, a landscape strip or a lawn panel. There's a variety of different names for it. But that amenity zone where you often might have street trees, this could be lawn, it could be paved. That entirely depends on the context that you're in. It is also important to think about what we call the frontage zone, which particularly in more dense urban environments, you may have the building frontages are set back a little bit from the property zone or from the property line or the right-of-way line. But often that setback space is still perceived by people to be part of the sidewalk realm. So that's an important piece to kind of keep in mind. It doesn't apply everywhere, but it can be an element. And so what the design manual establishes is both kind of minimum widths for the sidewalk. That really depends on the context. So a lot of the neighborhood streets would be a 5-foot wide minimum. The other downtown or commercial streets would be a 6-foot wide minimum. And then your really high pedestrian, high activity corridors would be an 8-foot minimum. And then there are also targets established for these different widths too. So just saying, the minimum is great when you can get more width and more space in there. And, as you go through and look at the volumes of pedestrian traffic, if it makes sense to widen that, here's what some of the targets are. It also identifies similarly for the amenity zone, some minimum widths. And these are really important from a pedestrian comfort standpoint too. Roads that end up positioning a sidewalk, right at the edge of the curb or within just a couple of feet from the edge of a roadway, particularly if there's no parking or other curbside use happening there. Walking down a sidewalk with cars going really fast right next to you isn't the most comfortable experience. And so, having the amenity zone have enough width in there that you can be able to put in street light poles or street trees or things like that and have it offset enough from the roadway that you can actually accommodate those and fit those in is a good thing, just from a pedestrian comfort and safety standpoint. And then it also helps identify just some overall target widths for that combined sidewalk and amenity zone area. And that also relates to both if you have parking or a curbside lane use on the street or not. So generally, if you don't have on-street parking next to where the sidewalk is or the pedestrian area is, you want that to be a little bit wider to have just more comfort and separation for people. And then, if you do have on-street parking, that parking can help function as a buffer a little bit and help, you don't need quite as much room. So that was the pedestrian one. Another critical one too, that is kind of at the intersection, no pun intended, between the pedestrian space and the vehicle space is thinking about corner geometry and in particular the design vehicle that's being used on a particular roadway. As many of you may know, or if you don't, there's a difference between what the actual physical curb radius is that's drawn on a roadway versus the effective curb radius, which is where the inside path of the vehicle is actually tracking. And oftentimes when you have things like, on-street parking or bike lanes or things that are pushing out where the vehicle is actually turning, your effective radius may be a lot bigger than what your actual radius is. And the effective radius is really what we should be designing towards relative to the design vehicle. So looking at different road types and thinking about what that key target design vehicle is and making sure that it's the effective radius that's needed for that design vehicle can be accommodated. And if so, you have a lot more flexibility to tighten up the radiuses, the actual physical radiuses that are out there to make straighter crosswalk crossings, to make all of that easier. Oftentimes, if you were to look at installing a bump out, for instance, on this corner, you can bump out all of this space that's in between that actual and effective curb radius in order to create more space for pedestrians at corners and things like that. The other note on design vehicle too, while there is a target design vehicle, it's important to think about like what does happen when some of these other vehicles come through here. If there needs to be a larger vehicle on occasion that comes through, or is it on a transit route or on a truck route where there's an expectation that you're going to have larger vehicles having to make turns more frequently, that may push you into choosing a different kind of curb radius based on those requirements and what other vehicles might be anticipated.
I might add, Oliver, that,
Yeah,
you know,
please.
in determining traffic and how much or how many of a certain type vehicle might be on a street or making a turning movement is the key question to ask. And I think we've realized that you ultimately could have a really large vehicle come down a street during its lifetime, or maybe once a year or twice a year. You don't end up designing for that particular situation. You design for what you expect will be the regular traffic along that street in terms of trucks and types of trucks. And that's what's important. It's nice to be conservative and saying, well, I'll design for this extra large truck that comes through a couple times a year, and I don't have to worry about my curb getting crushed or my sidewalk getting broken or my PED signal being knocked over. And that's nice, but the fact is, what's the likelihood of that really happening, or how much of that traffic would it take to actually end up breaking something or knocking something over? It's a game of probability, but I think I would caution you not to be ultra conservative, just so we're consistent across the area or along a street about how we predict traffic, and the kind of traffic we're predicting is more important, especially if we have to go to court. It's the consistency that counts when you're testifying in court, or I have to testify in court to protect the city. Not so much that real odd outlier. So it's not an easy question to answer. All I'm suggesting is just don't default to the biggest truck you can think of or you've seen coming down the street. And consider this, that as we move traffic around over the next decade, as we go to the two-way, as things really change, where trucks and cars and the kind of trucks and cars that are using different streets is going to be changing. So we do have to study that before we go in. Don't consider just because what you're seeing today is going to be what we designed for, because it is going to change. Thanks, Oliver.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dennis. Yeah, I should mention Dennis is probably going to lean in on a bunch of these, so feel free to jump in, cut me off whenever. Another kind of key layout design element relates to travel lane width. And so this design manual establishes citywide as a standard that that a 10-foot wide travel lane is used. And this design element does note where there's some exceptions to that. So 11-foot lanes may be granted for roads where you have, a high preponderance of heavy truck traffic, or, along high frequency transit corridors, where there's other, tight constraints that would not give those vehicles that flexibility to work within a 10-foot lane, and a little additional space is needed. And then just a note about where those are measured from. And then, and for instance, too, like when there's curb and gutter present, you're not measuring to the face of the curb, you're measuring to the edge of metal, or where the edge of the gutter line is next to the transit lane, those kinds of things. So again, to Dennis's point about consistency, where things are measured from, what the standard lane widths are, this section provides a basis for consistency on that. And then, getting to the questions around safety for all users, not just safety. I mean, and that includes, looking at it from a vulnerable user perspective, but oftentimes people forget that, when we're talking about safety on the roadway, it's also reducing vehicle speeds so that vehicle on vehicle crashes are lessened. So it's important that when we talk about volume or speed management, that's often framed as sort of taking away from vehicles to give it to, vulnerable users. but it's really about improving the safety outcomes for everyone that's using the roadway. And I think that's an important distinction to think through and to keep in mind. So just recognizing that slower streets are safe, are slower for everyone, or safer for everyone, excuse me. That speed is really the number one factor that affects crash severity and risk of injury across all types. And it's not just a matter of going out and saying, all right, well, we're going to just start changing the posted speed limits to put a lower limit in. That's not really an effective way of getting at changing speeds. You really have to change over time the physical conditions of the roadway to give drivers and everyone else the cues of how fast or slow that they should be going without needing to have a sign to reinforce that. Obviously, there's a lot of emphasis in the past of looking at volume and speed management on minor streets. So a lot of the kinds of treatments that you see on the screen here, I think something that cities really across the country are grappling with now is how do we start to apply volume and speed management in a genuine way to our major streets? What does that look like? How do these techniques adapt and work on major streets? I'm sure you may have heard that some big cities, I think Minneapolis was maybe one where they just went to a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit across the city. Well, how do you actually change the roadway to get people to drive at that speed as opposed to just trying to rely on a sign? So this is something the design manual lays out, techniques and methods for a lot of those different volume and speed management controls, but a lot of other elements feed into that too. So having narrower lane widths, having tighter turning radiuses, slow vehicles down when they're making turns, all of those kinds of things play into this as well.
I think the third point on the slide is especially a important one I want to draw your attention to. If there was a time when we designed roads, and if we had to have a curve, we would put a sign on it to let people know it was there, instead of trying to figure out a better way to, first of all, control the speeds as people approach that curve, or to not have the curve at all, or to design the curve differently. So I think if you need to put a sign somewhere, the first thing you need to look at is there a bigger problem with the overall design of this facility, and what can I do to change it? But then if you have to put the signs out there, and that happens, and it's necessary, you need to make sure that the signs align with what the street is and what you're trying to have people understand. It's better, you see the copy of the traffic circle in the lower right-hand corner, and you don't see a lot of signs there, do you? Because it's probably fairly clear to people what they have to do when they get there. And that's what you really want. I've seen traffic circles with dozens of signs on them, and I've seen traffic circles with 1 or 2 signs on them. To tell you the truth, the ones with the 1 or 2 signs worked as well as the ones with dozens of signs. And part of it might be that people weren't overloaded trying to figure out what all those darn signs meant. So number 3 is a real good point. If you can't, that's a takeaway for you.
Great, thanks, Dennis. The design manual lays out a lot of different intersection strategies and signalization related strategies too. And Dennis had mentioned this earlier during the upfront section, but the conventional approach and wisdom towards things like level of service for vehicles, this design manual gives you the power to say, oh, okay, a level of service D or even an E in many situations can be acceptable because it's a trade-off that we're making to prioritize other users, whether they be vulnerable users or just a higher percentage of a different mode of traffic on a particular roadway. And so the signalization strategies tie into that, and you can implement those strategies to help slow the road down and improve safety, and be able to make that trade-off with reducing the level of service for vehicles in order to accomplish that. So things like no turn on reds and different high pedestrian areas or intersections with protected bicycle infrastructure, signal timing, leading pedestrian intervals where those make sense to be installed. There's a lot of other things that can be done on the pedestrian signal, countdown timers, APS push buttons for accessible pedestrian signals, things like that. And then also going to just the phasing schemes themselves. So leading versus lagging left turns in the phasing, in the signal phasing, and moving more towards a lagging left that lets pedestrians make the crossings first without having to worry about left turning vehicles cutting across them, for instance, is something that a lot of communities are moving towards as well.
I joked to Oliver the other day when we were talking about this slide and how I didn't like leading left turns. And he makes a good point. Pedestrians is probably the first consideration why you wouldn't want that. But the other one goes back to that previous slide to a certain extent. If I have 95% of the traffic going straight through an intersection and 5% turning, why would I give preference to the people turning left as opposed to the majority of the folks using that street that need to move along and we need to clear away? So that's a question to ask yourself. I'm not giving you the answer, but that's the kind of question I think leads us to the best design for a location.
Another big one is on bicycle facility selection. And so at the start of the bicycle design element chapter starts off with this bicycle facility selection design element, which is required on every single street type. And really what this design element does is it walks through or provides a chart, which I'll show in a second, that really asks the project team to answer some questions around bicycle accommodations on that street to determine whether or not it should be a low stress or a high stress bicycle facility street. And based on that, what kinds of facilities might be called for in order to create a safe and accessible connection for people. This chart, there's a lot going on. It's kind of busy. I think this is a good one informationally to be aware of, though. And so what it's really saying is that, and this is based on a survey that was done across a number of municipalities in the country of all different sizes, and they pooled that survey information together. But essentially what it found is that on average, about 63% of the population was willing to bike and interested in biking to some degree, either for commuting or recreationally or anywhere in between. You had about a third of the people that just said, no way, no how, I'm not really interested in it. But when you start to break down that 63%, so these percentages that are in the color boxes are all add up to 100, just so that they're all within the 63%. What they found is that about 10% of the people were pretty strong and fearless and basically willing to bike ride around on anything. So these are a lot of people that may be doing, road bike riding for recreational riding. This is your spandex crew out there zipping around. And then they had about 8% of the respondents were in this enthused and confident category, which basically said, they're comfortable biking on non-residential streets. So streets that aren't, small local roads are going to be a street usually with a double yellow or a center line down it. So long as there's at least conventional bike lanes on that road. And so what you can see of your biking population, that's only about 20% of the people that you're actually hitting that are going to be willing to either ride in the road or ride using conventional bike lanes. So you're leaving out a huge chunk of the population that's interested in bicycling, but just doesn't feel confident and comfortable in being able to get around safely. So this is really what's starting to push, you hear about kind of the Dutch standard of, how things are being designed in many European cities for more safety and comfort. And so that move towards more separated bicycle lanes and separated facilities, or putting things onto much slower roads and designating them as bike boulevards and putting all the treatments in place to make that comfortable for people. That's really what this LTS, or level-less traffic stress 2 category is. And so as a starting point for thinking about a low stress bike route, if you're able to design to, that LTS 2 category, that you're hitting about 70% of the bike riding or willing bike riding population is going to be comfortable or is likely to be comfortable on that kind of facility. So you're going from 20% up to 70% right there, which is a pretty big jump. So wanted to kind of talk through that and lay that out because that ultimately feeds into decisions around bicycle facility selection, and just being aware that, you know, putting a bike lane, a conventional bike lane down, you know, on a road that's, you know, 35-mile-an-hour traffic without a lot of stops, there's not a lot of people that are going to be comfortable using that facility, and that may be reflected in your usership. And so what the design manual does is it identifies each of the different street types and what are potential low stress facilities that make sense within that street typology, given traffic volume, speed, all of those kinds of things, and what might be a standard facility. Kalamazoo does have a non-motorized plan. And so looking at those proposed routes relative to this question, I think that is important and is an important set of questions to ask as a project team. A route may be proposed on a non-motorized plan. Should that be part of the low stress network or not? Will be an important question to talk through. And again, the design manual itself provides detailed guidance on all of those different elements. So whether it's a side path, two-way or one-way, separated bicycle facilities, advisory bike lanes, there's a range of different methods described in the manual. I think I just have two more here. Another one, there's a range of design elements that are looking at kind of curbside strategies. So I've listed those off here. So one of them relates to curbside occupancy, which is things like platform dining or parklets, where curbside space can be repurposed and used as an extension of the sidewalk environment. But then guidance around commercial loading zones, metered parking areas, drop-off zones, and then something that the city is really starting to look at more is around neighborhood parking. And so what are the times of day? Is it 24-hour allowed parking? What neighborhoods is that being tested in? Really, you know, looking at other communities too. The great thing about having neighborhood parking is that when you have cars all up and down the side of the street, it narrows the rest of that roadway down for users and can actually help make your residential streets slower and keep traffic better regulated as they're going through those neighborhood streets. So there's some guidance around applicability and management of that. And then last, there are a number of design elements related specifically to transit operations. This was one just to pull off and highlight that we're starting to see communities in Michigan use a lot more. And this is an idea of a bus bulb. So it used to be that with transit vehicles, you'd create a cut in on the road so the transit vehicle could get out of the travel lane. And when you talk to transit operators, they're like, yeah, you know, that works. They're not backing up traffic, but then we have to deal with trying to merge back into traffic. And during rush hour, that can be a big impact on their headway. So moving towards approaches where you recognize that if this is a transit corridor, transit vehicles are going to stop and people are going to have to wait behind them. And so creating essentially a bump out where the transit stop is so that transit vehicles can stop in the travel lane and do all their boarding and lighting. And then this example also shows how you can accommodate bicycle connections through that boarding bulb too, to still allow for bicycle travel around the bus at these locations. Okay, I'll pause there. I know this was a lot to walk through. Tried to give you an overview of the process and hit on some of the key design elements. Any questions jumping out to the group right now? Happy to take those.
I guess I have a question on the governance. And this was all really impressive. I think the document, it's a lot of information, and you've done a really good job of distilling it and making it pretty clear and easy to understand. So kudos to everyone on that. But how is this document approved? How is it amended? And then if whether it's a neighborhood or adjacent property owner or a private developer, if someone's concerned about a standard, how do they appeal that decision if they want to, or can they?
Hi, this is Christina. Greg, I'll try to answer your question. And that question is from Greg, who is the chair of our Plan Commission. The document, I mean, this was created as a technical manual. And we have a lot of standards in the city that are, technical standards that we follow that don't necessarily go through a public review process in the same way that a neighborhood plan would. What we're going to be doing with this document, there are a couple things. So one, we will be updating through a public process our zoning code and updating the street type manual, or the street type map that's in the zoning code, and tying it with this one, right? Because this is a little more refined than what we have in the master plan. What's in the zoning code now reflects what's in the master plan. So through a public process, we'll have that review and discussion. And if we need to make changes through that review and discussion, then we'll deal with it at that time. Secondly, internally, obviously we'll be using it through our process, right? So that, I think that part is pretty clear when we do construction projects and how we do that and how we use it and apply it to our streets when we, the city, are leading the work. When it relates to a developer, this will be part of our site plan review process. So when you go to the site plan review page on the city's website, there are all those documents that you review. What does your water line need to be? What are their stormwater requirements? This will be part of that. And so this will guide what happens when the right of way is interrupted by a project. Now, that's typically not the whole street. Usually that's more of the pedestrian realm and the, maybe, the curb uses or on-street parking. So it's mostly that versus the whole street. And so that is how the document will be spread and used. I guess the one public piece would be, that we'd be discussing and, that could potentially be impacted would be what goes into the zoning code itself and how zoning standards like use and height or intensity of use would be tied to the typology manual, which is just one piece, right, of the larger document. I hope that answers your question. I guess I'll add one last bit. When we do neighborhood plans, we have 7 done. When we do more neighborhood plans, this would certainly be a guiding document that we would pull out and just, talk through with the neighborhoods as they're thinking about what streets are, how the streets function in their neighborhood network, particularly related to traffic calming, pedestrian facilities, and bike facilities.
Christina, if I could jump in too, I think one of the things that we talked a lot about too is the Complete Streets Committee also using the document.
Yes, thank you, Janet. So that is also a good point. So in the process part and related to the projects that make it into our capital improvements plan and what elements they include, we have with our complete streets policy, there are 2 committees. One is an internal committee that will be reviewing street projects in advance of them going in the plan. But the other part is using our Complete Streets Advisory Committee, or CSAC. And we have at least one CSAC member here today. They will be participating using this document to help us think through streets in that phase before they actually get into the CIP, the capital improvements plan, which is pretty, it starts to get more specific, right? We're starting to outline budgets and marching towards, design and construction. In the queue that we kind of are creating prior to that, the Complete Streets Advisory Committee will be using this document to help us think through those streets as another check for what needs to be included. Are we thinking about this now? What else do we need to know? So CSAC is made up of community residents, those that live, work, and play, not just residents, but those who work in town, who have either an interest or a stake in transportation. Yeah, so that's another good point, another way that the document will be used.
Oliver, I have a quick question too.
Yes, go for it.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm Kurt Artema. I work for a private developer, but I also serve on the CATS board and the Central County Transportation Authority. And my question is related to the street parking. So I heard a little bit of dialogue on street parking. To me, it's one of the easiest ways to solve a lot of issues related to speed, and reduces the need to have a bunch of surface parking lots in our urbanized area. So I'm wondering, we have a local ordinance right now that prohibits overnight street parking unless it's exempted. So I'm wondering how this manual interacts with that local law. And maybe Christina maybe has an update on that, but just curious on how this interacts with that.
Yeah, that's great. And I can turn it over to Christina here in a sec. I think what the design manual sets up is sort of laying out, particularly for that neighborhood level parking, sort of where the value and the benefit is in allowing that. And it does talk about the overnight parking and finding locations and having a process for implementing those exceptions, and kind of it's trying to set the design manual is trying to set the direction that this is a good thing to be exploring and to look at alternative ways of doing it. And that may mean pushing back on that ordinance. And Christina, I know you all are looking at some pieces related to that too.
Sure. This is Christina Anderson again, and I'll start, and maybe Dennis will want to chime in as actually the implementer, to kind of share the role. So we have started in the last couple of years to look at our on-street parking a little bit differently. And have started to, hear from residents the desire for greater access to that space, right? For both day and night parking. This was, one example of that is in the Vine neighborhood plan, exploring how on-street parking can be handled was one of the tasks in the plan. And it's something that, we had a small task force, talked about, did some studies on, and are in the process right now of changing over signs in that neighborhood to expand the opportunities for parking, again, both day and night. We know that this, the next neighborhood will likely be downtown. There's a lot of interest there, but the city is open to, looking and exploring and hearing from residents and setting our street up, the space that we have, because you're right, Kurt, not only does that space serve as an asset, a place to put the car, but when those cars are parked in between, curb to curb, they also provide kind of a natural traffic calming function there. And so it's a quick and easy way to check two boxes.
Yeah, I think I've been looking at a couple things regarding parking, and again, we're as we go through the Vine neighborhood, we've been looking at providing more parking where we could. That's been one thing, and kind of eliminating all the different kinds of signs and standardizing parking. Parking does help slow traffic down. I've seen it in other communities where I've worked. And I just finished some traffic calming analysis yesterday, and even just painting a line down a road on both sides will give me 1.5 mile reduction in the average speed an hour. So there's a lot of benefit. The downside, and we have to figure out how we want to deal with this, is that on many streets where we get complaints regarding speeding cars and you need to calm it, as I look at the crash data, and I'm using 10 years of crash data, so it's a good history, I find that on many streets, the biggest problem is of parked cars being hit. not only by cars going down the street, but cars backing out of driveways into their neighbors' cars. And it's really interesting when I find that's such a problem. And how do we deal that, especially as we encourage or allow people to park even more and more. So it's not necessarily a downside, but it is something that we're going to have to deal with, because often people have their property damaged, and the police can't ever find who did the damage. And so that's one of those little irritating kind of neighborhood problems that you have. But again, we can work through that, talk about it. But I'm interested, again, just on another point, snow is always a problem. One thing we have to worry about is clearing streets if we're going to allow people to park overnight consistently around the city. We also have to implement some type of snow emergency process, so that when we do have to clear 6 or 12 or 20 inches of snow off a road, we can get our trucks down that, and people know that they should at least try to find another place for their cars. For this area, that's important. We get big dumps of snow, and we have to roll that in. So there's a number of other items we're talking about, but I would say in general, we're looking for ways to put more people along the streets. We just have to figure out how to do it the right way.
Well, and I'd say I appreciate the feedback, and I'd say look at the examples around us. It's certainly, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Every other major urban area in the Midwest is doing it. So I think there's answers out there.
Susan, I think she's had her hand up for some time. If you want to ask your question.
Real quickly, Kalamazoo College is a very hilly campus, and one of the things we're struggling with is a lot of slips and falls, particularly on inclines. And I know generally when the incline of the sidewalk matches the incline of the street, you would assume you wouldn't have a handrail. But does any of this preclude putting handrails in places where we're seeing a lot of slips and falls because of the incline?
Yeah, the manual doesn't speak directly to that handrail question, but I think given that's its omission, I don't think there would be anything that would be a conflict with it. The main thing to bear in mind would be that it's critical that the clear zone of the sidewalk and whatever width that gets established based on the street type that you're on, that be clear and doesn't have any obstructions in it. So, if a handrail were to be installed, for instance, having it right at the edge of the outside edge of the sidewalk along the right-of-way line or something like that could make sense and could work. But so sorry, I don't have more detail than that, but okay.
Any other questions? Yeah, sorry.
Oh, Scott.
Yes, Scott.
Hello there.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So I was listening, and the only thing I wanted to point out is that looking at some of the lanes and those kind of things, I'd just like to put in perspective the fact that our apparatus are 10 feet edge to edge. So if we're talking about a 10-foot wide roadway, that's going to be virtually impossible. And then as you add snow into that, or you add someone that can't park or something like that, I just want to make sure that we keep that in mind. I know every time that we have a project that comes through and I throw something out, reference a fire access lane, or we talk about access in general. I know that Bobby and I've had this discussion, and I've had this discussion with other people, is the apparatus, which, like Dennis said, we're not talking about a once a year kind of thing or a big truck coming down the road or something like that. We may not have a fire on that road every week or something like that, but with a bunch of businesses or a bunch of occupancies on one road, that truck may drive down that street once or twice a week. It may not go to one specific location, but it may be out on that street repetitively going somewhere else. Or that may be a connecting street for some other reason. So I know that fire access has always been kind of a a question in the past for different site plans and those kind of things. Looking at turning radius for our apparatus and those kind of things, just keeping in mind that our apparatus are 10 foot, they're 119 inches, so 10 foot edge to edge. And if we're looking at like specific turning radiuses and stuff like that, if we are going forward with trying to make smaller turning areas, or if we're trying to look at doing different traffic calming kind of things, maybe this is something that as public safety going forward, if we're going to get into some sort of different redesign of something, maybe we need to look at different apparatus, because we are in the process next week, actually, we'll be going out to do a spec for our new ladder truck. Our ladder truck we have right now is 25 years old, so we're in the process of replacing it, but you're talking about $1.4 million to replace a fire truck. And even a regular fire engine you're pushing about 750,000 right now. So if we're looking down the road, we're looking at fire trucks that are 20 plus years old, trying to get them down smaller and smaller roads or traffic calmed roads or something like that. I just want to put that out there of, if we're doing a $1.4 million investment into a piece of apparatus, we want to just make sure that we can still get it to the places that we need to go, and not just want to get it to the places we need to go, but thinking in the future, this could be here for 20 years. Is this something where in the future, our next piece of apparatus, we need to look at a different model, we need to look at a different design, or what? I'm not just throwing it out there.
Yeah, if I'm sure others want to jump in here too, but I'd like to say a couple of things. So I know we talk about this 10-foot lane width, and that is what we're talking about, but there's some subtlety there. So whenever it is essentially up against a curb, your effective lane width really is 11 feet, because it's not from the curb, it's from the edge of the gutter pan, if you will. So, usually when you're up against the curb, your effective lane width is 11. So that 10 feet is really when you've got some additional asphalt, right? When you've either got additional lanes, or you've got a bike lanes, or you've got, parking or something else, trying to keep the amount of asphalt, and then if it, obviously there's not too many cases where you truly have a one lane road, but if you did, the chances of making that one lane road just that 10 feet probably, I don't want to speak in a way that I know every possible scenario, but usually at those points, if it's truly a one lane road, it's going to be something more than just that 10 feet, with the understanding that that's all you have. So the 10 feet is really there because most of our roads are multi-lane, right? And so, when we've got an emergency vehicle, if people do what they are supposed to do, move to the side, move over, the vehicle should have plenty of room to get through. And then I think the other thing with the turns is, we did talk about that sort of effective radius. And also, again, I think with the emergency vehicle, there is that expectation that if necessary, they can do that wide turn. And that, again, people are going to be able to move out of their way or get out of their way to do that if they need to, if it's truly a tight street, which I'm sure is something that occurs already, right? There are just streets out there today that they're two local narrow streets. And if you're bringing a really piece of big equipment, right, you're going to do a wide turn. You're going to turn into that oncoming lane, and then come back to the through lane. So those, I just want to put those two general things out there. Access of fire equipment and emergency equipment is really important to good street design. And you can say things, I think, around lane widths and still acknowledge, like, outriggers, for instance, on some fire equipment, right? They need often 20 feet. Well, you could have that, two 10-foot lanes get you that 20 feet, right? Yes, it is the oncoming lane, but the assumption is when the fire truck's there, that's going to be cleared and you're going to have that full access. So there are ways, I think, that we think about these things when we're designing complete streets. They are really important. while still trying to achieve some of the objectives that we talked today. So hopefully that gives you a certain comfort level. And I don't know if others want to add to that.
I think that those are good points, Scott. And I just wanted to mention, like Janet did, when we look at a lane width, I'm going to look at the whole cross section of the street. And basically, we're going to allocate different formal lanes for different uses. But for example, whenever I paint a bike lane now, while I take it away from the normal driving through lane, that 5 feet is still available for other uses. And multiple uses is kind of one of the things we've been experimenting with. So again, that's a real good point. That's the kind of question and analysis I think as design teams should spend their time on. And that we didn't always do that in the past. You know, we just defaulted to some answers. So again, this fits really in line with this whole manual and the approach that we're promoting.
I appreciate it, Dennis, and Janet. I appreciate it as well. I guess that was just kind of my biggest thing is I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. And obviously, Dennis, you and I work together a lot, and so I appreciate not only the questions and the answers, but being able to kind of collaborate with one another and be like, hey, this is the reason why I am looking for this, and this is the reason why you're looking for this, and just I guess that's the biggest thing is just the collaboration, making sure that we're both on the same path so that we come up with the best product at the end.